So we know that Piaget was a constructivist, which he believed that children need to be able to be given the opportunity to drive their own learning, ask questions, inquire, and be able to explore and make sense of the world for themselves, not just based off of what someone else tells them. So to understand his theory, you need to also understand who he is, because that helps explain why he sees the world the way he does. His father was an academic, very busy man, very studious. And his mom, from what I've read, it seems like she suffered from some mental health issues, specifically depression. And so she was a little bit hands off just due to some of the issues she was dealing with. That meant he spent a lot of time alone. So he spent a lot of time exploring nature and the world. I believe even at the age of 11 or 12, he published his first essay on, I think it was the life of sparrows. So he was very in tune with what was going on around him and learning from that. During this time, there was a big trend in IQ testing and trying to see where children were at cognitively and ranking them on percentiles. But after getting involved in this and testing children, he realized that it was really flawed. So he disagreed with this IQ testing trend because as he was asking kids questions, he realized that children might just view the world differently. And that's why they give a certain answer. So it's not necessarily wrong, but it's through their experiences. And he was much more interested in why a child would get an answer supposedly wrong, or why they would see the world in a certain way rather than having a right or wrong answer. So in Piaget's theory, he has these two concepts that go together, assimilation and accommodation. And he believed that this is how we grow intellectually and change our schema and making sure new information can fit with it. So assimilation is the process when we take in information and make it fit with what we already know. Okay. Maybe we are walking into a school and you see a person standing in the classroom getting things ready. Well, that person is probably the teacher, right? You are kind of making it fit with what you already know. But sometimes we take in information and it doesn't quite fit with what we know, and therefore we have to accommodate and create new knowledge to make that information fit. And when it finally does, we reach equilibrium. Now, Piaget said it's okay for students to be in disequilibrium where it's not quite fitting and they struggle with stuff a little bit, because that leads to deeper learning. When things aren't quite fitting together and they have to ask more questions and they have to try to figure it out, again, that's important for the learning process. One example I have, and down here I have a link to it, if you haven't seen the show Bluey, it's these funny kind of characters. And it's a kid's show. But in one of the episodes I was watching with my friend's son, they were driving in the car. And in the car, you see that the father is driving the car seat and the wheel is on a different side of the car. So as we're watching this, her son says, "Oh, this show is from England." And I said, "No, actually, this show is from Australia." And he's like, "No, it has to be from England because the steering wheel is on the other side." Well, he had been to England, so therefore he had learned that information, and he then saw this show and he assimilated it with what he already knew. But in fact, there are a lot of countries where you drive on the other side of the road than we do here in the United States. So I had to explain that to him. I'm like, "Oh, it's actually from Australia." And I had to show him pictures and convince him that, yes, in fact, this can happen in other countries as well. And eventually he accommodated that information to reach equilibrium. This can happen in lots of different ways. A funny story that my mom often tells from when I was younger, I got a present from my grandmother for Christmas, and it was actually a plastic, this is weird, like a toy iron. But my mom hates ironing, and I had never seen one before, so I picked up the iron, put it to my ear, and said, "Hello," because I assimilated it and thought it was maybe a telephone. So I made that assimilation, I made a mistake, and then they had to explain what an iron was to me, and I accommodated that. Some other examples would be a child sounding out new words, right? They use what they know phonetically about words to try to say them and breaking it down. Also thinking the tallest person in the room is the oldest for young children. When you look around, with your peers or in a school, like fifth graders are taller, and they are older. But if you go into a room with a bunch of adults, that doesn't necessarily make sense because we stop growing at a certain point, and some people are going to be taller and some people will be shorter, and it doesn't correlate with their age. Now, another kind of adult example would be learning a new language. For instance, in Spanish, there are a lot of words that sound like English words, but there are also some that can confuse you. And for example, in Spanish, there is a word embarazada. Well, many of my students, when I was teaching high school Spanish, would see that word and they'd be like, oh, that means embarrassed. And if you'd say, estoy embarazada, which you think you're saying, oh, I'm embarrassed, you're actually saying, I'm pregnant. So again, you can't always, then when you learn, you're like, oh, no, that's not what I want to say. You'd have to then accommodate that information. We do this all the time with stereotypes too. Probably even when you're walking across campus, you look at someone, you're like, oh, that looks like someone who might be a student athlete. Oh, that looks like someone who might be in a sorority. Your brain does that. And sometimes you're wrong, and then you have to accommodate and understand that someone's identity goes beyond what they just physically look like. An example that is given in the book says, you are reading a book with a child. There is a picture of a cow. The child says, dog, bark, bark. How would Piaget explain this? Well, if you look at this, right, if they've never seen a cow before, they have to think, what's that animal? Well, it's an animal kind of with spots. It has 4 legs. And they'll say, okay, well, I know what a dog is. It kind of looks like a dog, right? So you assimilate that. But then when you hear what that is not barking, it's mooing, and someone's like, no, that's a cow, the child then has to accommodate that information and understand that there are other animals, 4-legged animals in this world. Another example I have is when my family was in San Antonio, Texas, and in the morning I told my daughter, we're going to go see the Alamo, which is an historic site. She seemed very, very excited, but then once we got there, she starts looking around and she's like, where's Elmo? Because when I said Alamo, that means nothing to her. She tries to fit that word with what she knows. It kind of sounds like that character from Sesame Street, Elmo, and that was the confusion. She assimilated that and it was incorrect. So I helped her accommodate by explaining where we were, and let me tell you, she was not happy. In fact, here's the picture of that look she gave me when she realized she was not seeing Elmo that day. Now moving into the major stages of cognitive development, I actually think this is kind of like the least interesting part of Piaget's theory, but probably what he's most known for, moving from sensory motor to pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational thinking. And what he said is there are qualitative differences in reasoning among these different stages that we move through. Sensory motor, which you will not observe, but that's birth to 2, and this is when children start to achieve object permanence. So objects that are out of view do not exist. So children under the age of 1 do struggle with this, and even probably around 9 months, many children kind of start to understand that, oh, just because I don't see it, it could still exist. But before that, because children lack the mental representation, it is hard for them. But about 4 to 8 months, children will track a toy even if it's partially hidden, but not if it's fully hidden. This is why with a young child, like maybe if they're really attached to the mother and she leaves the room, they become very agitated. This is why peekaboo is so exciting for young children, right? You cover your face, it's like you're gone and then you're there again, which would not work with older children because they have object permanence. A not B error, I encourage you to watch the video of this, but it's just the idea. It's interesting during the sensory motor period that hiding an object, and a child gets it the first time, great. Again, you hide it in a new place. They see you hide it in that place. They will actually go back to that first location. So Piaget called this A not B error in behaviorism. There would probably be a different explanation for this, such as rewarding a child for that first time they find the object. But Piaget called this A not B error, and he just said it was an interesting cognitive feature of this sensory motor period. Also during the sensory motor stage, this is when children develop symbolic thought, where one thing can stand for another, like words stand for objects, like cup is that thing you can drink out of. There's a word for that. Mama, apple, bottle, they learn that that word, that symbol, actually stands for an object. We also see deferred imitation, where children can remember and reproduce what they have observed so they can hold on to it a little bit. Like I have this picture of a boy with a sippy cup. My nephew used to drink from his sippy cup and then go, ah. Well, those are some things that he had observed from like his mother and older sister and then was doing it himself. The pre-operational stage, this is a wonderful stage, ages 2 to 7. where children are not yet capable of thinking logically. So it is really easy to kind of fool them, or they really do believe in magical things like the tooth fairy. We also see hierarchical classification where things can be members of multiple groups at the same time, such as, a young child before achieving this say, that's no woman, that's my mommy. Like there's one word for each thing, that's mom. She can't also be a woman and a wife and a friend. But over time, they learn that you can be part of different categories. Here's an example of kind of how logic is still in early development in the early years. These are for my friend's child who's in a preschool class. This is what they said they wanted to be when they grow up. So the different things. One of them that really made me laugh was, if you look at Ethan, he said he wants to be letter, a piece of hair, or a hand. And in his mind, this is completely logical. These are things that you can be when you grow up. And again, that improves over time. If you ask an 8-year-old what they want to be when they grow up, they'll probably give you different actual occupations. Animism is when non-living objects have lifelike qualities, like a leaf blowing in the wind. A child might think it's following them. Or I have a picture here of a wave. You go in the ocean, it's that wave is attacking them. It has lifelike qualities. Egocentrism is when children see the world from their own point of view and assume others do as well. There's a link there to look at the actual experiment that Piaget did with children to kind of show this point. But it's even like when I would talk to my nephew on the phone, he would be like, oh, isn't this toy so cool? And I'm like, well, I can't see what's in your hand because I'm in a different state. But he's like, so I'm like, oh, what, toy? And he's like, the one in my hand. I'm like, okay, but what is it? The one I'm holding, right? Not understanding that, okay, he can see it, but I can't because I'm in another location. So that's egocentrism. Then moving into concrete operational, this is where you'll see a lot more logical thinking. And in fact, children kind of want some reasoning behind things that happen, but not yet skilled in abstract thinking. So that Piaget said that is still kind of stretching children when you ask them to think hypothetically. When my niece was around 9 years old, I used to do magic tricks with her all the time. And by the time she was 9, she's like, how are you doing that? What's the trick there? And she no longer really believed that it was something that was magical. She wanted the reason or my trick of how I did it. Concrete operational stage. This is where children can master conservation tasks. So properties of an object do not change just because the appearance changes. And so I encourage you to watch that video to look at how responses change and how children, as they move beyond, these conservation tasks and can master them, they can see, okay, just because you take a piece of Play-Doh that's a ball, 2 pieces, and roll one out, it's still the same amount, right? You haven't taken any away, you haven't added any, you've just changed the shape, it's still the same. Whereas young children are like, oh, you've rolled it out, that's longer, so it must have more. And here are some of them. It shows you in the books the different tasks they did with those and at what age children typically can figure it out, whereas volume is much more complicated because you're kind of thinking about not just amount, but changing the shape of something else you put it in. The concrete operational stage as well, children are able to start to decenter. They can focus on multiple aspects of a task, such as the bottle drawing experiment. So if you were to say, each bottle is half full of water, please shade in where the water would be. You'd have to think about the water being half full, but also gravity. So when you change it and you shift the angle of it, it's still going to be at the bottom because gravity is going to pull it down. It's not just going to stay in the bottom half of the bottle. And here's an example of kind of drawing by a pre-operational kid, right? Because they're not thinking about gravity. And even in that last picture, you see water at the top, that it's floated to the top. Okay, so the last thing that I want us to think about is the formal operational stage. And this is where children can think hypothetically. So like, what would life be like without thumbs? Well, a young child might be like, oh, I couldn't give a thumbs up. Whereas an older child would be like, oh, wow, we'd have to re-engineer everything in the world because our world revolves around us having thumbs. Also in the book, it talks about some other things where they can isolate variables, can think about possibilities that don't exist, and can think logically and abstractly and solve problems like this, where you could solve for X. So also visit the limitations in the textbook, and that there are a lot of limitations to his work. So it has some great ideas, but also a lot of limitations to it.